Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina, and on behalf of Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Harnessing AI as a Collaborative Partner for Ethical Research and Writing, which is sponsored by Springer Nature. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Now I'll just put a couple links in the chat where you can register for upcoming webinars and watch previous webinar recordings. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to submit any questions or comments for our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you like or would like to be addressed. Also, there's closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the Show Captions button on the bottom panel of your screen. You can also turn on automated translation for the captions by clicking the arrow button, toggling on translation, and selecting your preferred language. Last, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with links to the recording and where to find today's slides. Also, if you're interested in library technology, LibTech Insights, or LTI, is a content vertical from Choice that examines the day-to-day impact of library and education technology on academic librarians, researchers, and students. The channel provides practical guidance on technology trends and products, including AI and AI literacy, user experience, useful tools, and job profiles, all of which are written by and for librarians. So you can find out more about LTI and read the blog via the links in the chat. We send out one email a week and our latest posts and some with our latest posts and some handpicked tech news stories, usually in the realm of AI. Okay, and with that, we're ready to get started. So I will hand it over to Stacy.
Hi, I'm Stacy Best Rule. I work with Springer Nature, and I'm very happy to welcome you to today's webinar. But before we get started, we wanted to show a poll. Here, hopefully you can see the poll question. If you could just take a few moments to answer it, and we just want to get a feel for how librarians that have joined us are feeling about their ability to teach and partner with researchers and students on using AI ethically. And we're very excited to share some best practices that have been explored, and hopefully we are getting close to the end of the poll. I think Sabrina's going to show us the results so we can see, okay, this is good. So we have a nice mix. All right, perfect. Again, just to reiterate what Sabrina said about the Q&A, please put your questions, any questions, and at the end we will address as many of them as we can. But let me introduce now our speakers. We have Yulia Sevryugina from the University of Michigan Health Sciences Libraries. She is a chemistry librarian there and has done some pretty interesting research and investigation into how students are using AI. And then we also have Helen Bischoff, who's the coordinator of library services at University of Kentucky. And she has done some interesting activities and done some different workshopping ideas, and will share many of her best practices with us. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Julia to get started.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yulia Sevryugina. As Stacy mentioned, I work at University of Michigan Library. And thank you so much for inviting me to present at this seminar. I want to put a small, disclaimer that even though I'm very happy to give you some insights of my own learning process and my own professional journey with this new technology, I do not consider myself, an expert, and I'm learning with everyone else on a spot about this technology. But today I will be, happy to share with you how in my liaison role in a library, I try to promote practical and responsible use of AI for writing and research in STEM. So when OpenAI released, ChatGPT in November 2022, of course, everyone was very eager to try this new tool. And when in fall 2023, it really reached university campuses, and at this point, many instructors, if not changing their assignments, they were definitely thinking of how it applies to some assignments, especially writing assignments that they have for their courses. And there was this interesting article circulating in Chronicles of Higher Education that listed all the different ways that students were using ChatGPT. As a liaison librarian, I have been, I teach many different instructional sessions in, different departments. And for example, for biochemistry course, for several years, I have been teaching Wikipedia editing because that was part of writing assignment they had for this class. So in fall 2023, the professor, also reached out to me and said, okay, maybe we should do this year something different, something with ChatGPT. And, that was, very interesting. And I suggested that that's a great idea, but if we do it, let's really approach it as educational project. And yes, of course, it required some more considerations from us, designing a survey, submitting IRB. But the benefit of this was that we were really able not only to teach students AI literacy, right? So like introduce what Gen AI tools are available, which tools they may use to help them with scientific writing. And of course, also teach them how they should use these tools ethically, right? To use them to validate information, to think critically when they receive this output from a different tool, and really, think about transparency, about, copyright, plagiarism, about environmental impacts, like really promote ethical standards when you work with these tools. But also, this allowed us to really evaluate and learn from this experience, and every year try to grow, to improve, and to, really assist students with what their requests are. So basically, these tools we implement into the writing assignment that students have for this class. So at the end of the class, it's a biochemistry class for upper level undergraduate and graduate students, and they have to prepare a mini review article in one of biochemistry topic at the end of the semester. So when we implemented these tools, we decided that, okay, students can start from some draft. In this case, of course, this draft will look like a, draft produced by ChatGPT. And then we will introduce in the middle this kind of like a system of exercises that really will help students to validate information, think how many details this essay has, complement this essay, then present their experiences to instructor, to their peers, have some discussion, have some feedback. And at the end, the students will also add their own writing into this draft and produce a final essay, which will look more like, biochemistry article. And here is a timeline for how this assignment develops. It really develops throughout the entire semester, and my involvement as a librarian is really throughout the entire semester. So I start with introductory lecture about Gen AI. And after a couple of weeks, I have additional session about specifically focusing on prompt literacy. So if students still have some remaining questions, if they struggle at this point to develop effective prompts, here they have me available for them to help with that. And towards the end of the semester, like week 9th of the semester, students will have to present their drafts of their essays and also present like what was their experience with using those tools to develop those drafts. And at this point, we have like a feedback, discussion session. And then we still give them additional 3 weeks when they can reflect on this feedback, complement the essay, and arrive at the final, final document that they submit for grading. Details of this assignment we actually were able to publish in Journal of Chemical Education, and you are welcome to look into this article for more details. But I want to talk a little bit more about like different components of this assignment. So for example, for my library instruction, I focused on really just developing AI literacy in these students because they all come with different level of knowledge. So I would, introduce what are large language models, like what are Gen AI tools, what are the benefits of using them and what are the pitfalls, and especially stressing out like what ethical, what environmental concerns, what are potential biases in using this technology. I try to emphasize the transparency and we allowed students to use these tools, but we wanted them to be, transparent and really talk about how they use it, what their experience is. And then, finally, I concluded with details specific to that assignment. And I'm posting QR codes on this slide for my lectures in 2024 and 2025. As technology develops so fast, my lectures have to be updated very often. So, next year, I'm sure we'll have to update them again. So just be aware of it that, we always need to update, some of information from older years may not be applicable. And also in this, we stressed about like transparency, right? We had a discussion, is it how ethical it is, right? That ChatGPT is, could be used as an author in, a couple of publications where published with ChatGPT being an author, right? And there was like all this discussion, is it ethical? Shall we do it? Shall we not do it? So, we were discussing like how students should use it for this class, but also in a real life, right? For example, I refer them to this article that analyzed journal policies across the whole world for if AI can be used for peer review in journals. And it looked like journals that are based in US or in Europe are still pretty prohibitive in using this technology for peer review, for example. And the same applies to grants. Like you cannot really use AI to generate a grant. So I wanted students to understand that difference, like what we allow in a class versus what is in a real world, and how they should really check with specific agency or journal, before using or not using those tools. For our own class, I refer them to this article from Alia Albada and Woods that, suggested a nice statement to for like AI contribution statements. So if we use AI, these are the details that would be important to know. And it was a suggestion to students to use those statements when they prepared their essays. We also talked about prompt literacy, like what are the basic principles of, developing effective prompts. I gave them examples of common prompts or how we can modify, debug ChatGPT prompts, and how can we like somewhat reduce biases through the prompt as well. And it was interesting. Because we approach this as a educational project for us, also to learn about student experiences. So we asked students at the end, like how many like prompts they need to be to modify in order to succeed in a specific task. So for example, so in blue is like how many prompt modifications were needed. So for example, for word count, because essay had to be, I think, 1,000 words. So they somewhat struggled with that and had to modify prompts a lot because it's a probabilistic tool and it's never exactly 1,000 words. But at the end, in this, I don't know, olive color bars, you can see like how successful it was. And basically 80% of students, they were pretty happy in achieving the required word count. However, for the level of details in their essays, like around 60% of students struggled with, having appropriate level of detail. And still at the end, only 40% of students were satisfied with level of detail provided, even though they tried to modify their prompts. And the same applies to bibliography. So bibliography, like some students, really like struggle to modify their prompts, and at the end only like 30 to 40% of students were happy with the quality of bibliography generated by these tools. And a little bit more about bibliography. So we actually now submitted another paper in also Journal of Chemical Education. It's under review now. But what it showed us, we basically analyzed all the references that were generated by these, different tools that students were using. And we found that around like maybe only 60% of them, they were existing and correct references. Then about, maybe 20% or 18%, they had some sort of errors or mistakes. And around 30% of them were completely fabricated, like non-existent references at all. And it was interesting when we looked at type of references. So this is a biochemistry class, right? And students are writing more on the topic of this like nucleic acid biochemistry. So a lot of references, a lot of information on this type of topics are in nature type journals. And it seemed like if we separated nature from non-nature family journals, it seems like references from nature family were mostly correct, and references from non-nature family journals were, they were very often non-existent references or something was incorrect. And the same, like if you try to look like medical versus non-medical journals. So like non-medical journals or like more like multidisciplinary journals, right, like Nature, they would have a lot of correct references, and journals that were like more specialized, like very like specialized in the field of like medicine. So those would have a lot of non-existent or fake references, and that's very sad and unfortunately, and it tells us about this disciplinary knowledge of these tools that in this specific class of biochemistry they could use multidisciplinary journals like Nature or and references were mostly correct, but if we talk about some specific narrow discipline, that may be actually very worrisome at looking at what type of references are generated. And here is actually kind of like how it looks like. So for example, this student, he wrote an essay about RNA therapeutics for neurodegenerative diseases. And he used ChatGPT 3.5. And if you analyze this reference one by one, you can see like in green. So those first reference is, correct, but it's irrelevant. It was not relevant to the topic that student was writing essay about. So he actually did not use this reference at the end. There are other references where you see like green with a little bit of red. So there are like some mistakes in a year, in a volume, in issue number. So you maybe would be able to find that reference, but it definitely does not really, give correct information about, credit to authors and, and then there are some references which are highlighted in red color here, and those references were completely fabricated, non-existent references. The unfortunate part about it, though, is that those references were included in students' final essay. And that was despite of our, of us insisting, really stressing out that students had to check and validate all the references. We still found those fake references in the end. And that tells all of us about like research integrity, teaching research integrity, and like how critical, it is and how successful it really can be, because we can only do so much, and then, we would still have, our records will be basically deteriorated, with some fake or non-existing references, which is unfortunate. In terms of tools, we really opened it to students to use whichever tools they wanted. We recommended, ChatGPT, whichever version the student had access to. At University of Michigan, we also have our own tool. It's called UMGPT. And last fall, 2025, these are the number of tools that it contained, but it gets updated every now and then, depending on progress of this technology. The good thing about this tool that they really try to kind of reduce biases. They ensure that results are not shared with any third party, that information is protected, private, and is not used to train any AI models. So there is like additional trust in using that tool as compared, to some commercial tools. And we also found that some students used Claude, Notebook LM, Learning Clues. It's also our local tool developed by one of my collaborators, and Consensus, Elicit, and Research Rabbit. And what we found also about like which tools students preferred to use. So the blue bar, it shows like which factors were important for students to use the specific tool. And the light blue bar, it shows like which factors are important for students to recommend a tool for the next year. So in terms of what they really used in the class, it seems like important was how useful was the tool and how familiar they were with that tool. Now, in terms of recommending tool to someone else for, for future years, they really thought about, quality of the output that this tool could produce. And, as long as there is some sort of task alignment, so this tool is good for this specific task. And interesting, if we look at trust, for example, so trusting a tool, and I just explained you a little bit about our local tool, right? How it like provides more privacy, security, and so on. So it seemed like trust was very important component specifically for recommending a tool. So that's something to think about for us when we, subscribe to specific tools, when we teach students the tools that they really trust really matters to them. Overall, when we ask students provide some 3 adjectives on what was their experience in working with Gen AI, and then we put it in a word cloud, and that's what the distribution is, right? So they say it was helpful, easy, fast, but also you can see like it was frustrating or, like tedious or cautious, right? So there are many different views on and different aspects. What was most helpful about this assignment, what students told us, they really appreciated practice time. And that's why we did not really give them a specific prompt that they could use for the, writing assignment, but we asked them to, develop themselves those prompts, interact with the tools. And they say that was really helpful to them. They could practice, they could, succeed, fail, and they learned throughout this process. Another thing that they said was helpful was having library lecture. They said that was important for them to really like set expectations, to warn them, to like what they can expect, what the pitfalls, what the benefits. And that's where our roles as librarians are very important in really, providing that type of AI literacy to our students. And they also appreciated the assignment structure, that it was really, throughout the semester. And you all are welcome to adapt it. But yeah, we asked them about timeline and there were no complaints. They said just a perfect timeline and gives them enough time to really develop the final essay. So that was encouraging. And because we are doing it every single year, it is really interesting to see how this develops over the years. So for example, in 2023, when we ask students how familiar they are with ChatGPT, about 41% were slightly familiar, and that was our majority. Now, last fall in 2025, the majority of students said they were moderately familiar or somewhat familiar. So they really kind of already increased their level of familiarity with these tools. And the same, like we asked in 2023 if they had account with ChatGPT. And at that point, only 60% of students had an account, which is already a big number. But now in 2025, we had 83% of students already having a ChatGPT account. And, that basically tells us, this technology is here to stay, and more and like students are very familiar with that. And when we ask them whether they're going to use these tools in the future beyond our class, the majority of students, 82% said that yes, they are planning to use it in the future. Now, in this graph, and it's actually also another article that we submitted for review in journal AI in Education. So hopefully you can also like read full details of this article soon. The dark blue indicates students who had negative experience in the class, and light blue indicate number of students who had positive experience in a class. So whether students had positive or negative experiences, they still will be using it in the future. And only 18% of students, they actually said, no, we're not going to use it in the future. The majority of those students had negative experiences. And when we ask, why, they basically said that, yes, we have, a greater ethical awareness. We have now prompt engineering skills that allow us to use those tools. And 68% of students said, yes, these tools are useful to me in some respect or another. So basically, it's also like tells us that we do need to provide AI literacy. We do need to continue teaching and guiding our students. And yeah, thank you everyone. And just couple of slides that will be available to you afterwards, where I list all the different resources. Some of them are developed by wonderful colleagues in my library. Some of them are developed, in some other libraries. But yeah, thank you everyone. And I pass it to my colleague, Helen.
Thank you, Yulia. Thank you so much for sharing all of your research with us today. Let's see that your work actually sets up what I'm going to present really well. My name is Helen Bischoff, and I'm the coordinator of liaison services at the University of Kentucky Libraries. And what I'm going to share are practical applications that I've used in the classroom, so via like small case studies. And this is in instruction, in consultations. But before we dive in, I want to give you a little more context about who I am and the work that I do as well. So what I am is a former K-12 teacher turned academic librarian. I'm a library liaison. I serve on our STEM team here at the University of Kentucky. I am the coordinator of liaison services for our libraries. My instructional design uses active learning. It really focuses a lot on student engagement. So that is my style of teaching. I experiment with a lot of different information literacy and AI approaches in my teaching, but what I am not, I am not an AI expert. I do not build AI tools. I don't work for any AI companies. I am not being paid for this presentation today, even. So for every successful activity I have in a classroom, I can cite at least 10 failures or times when things did not go planned as I wanted them to in instruction. And that's something that I think a lot of us probably experience, whether we're dealing with AI or not. And so that's what I'm going to share today are some of those things that I have experienced that have been successful, but also know that there's a lot behind that curtain that hasn't been successful. And feel free to ask about that as well. So a question that I get a lot, and I think that a lot of people are thinking, is AI replacing or supporting us? And here's the way I think about it. What if the biggest risk of AI in research isn't that it's writing for us, but that we stop thinking critically about how we're using it? So today I'm going to share a few of those examples that touch on a variety of university populations, and those include an Alzheimer's research team, undergraduates who are evaluating a podcast, some new faculty consultations, an accessibility presentation discussion that I had recently, and then also students with fluency or learning challenges. So to be clear, the issues of AI use is a recurring theme across all of my consultations with faculty, students, and in my classes. So what I'm seeing is that students seek clarification. Faculty question how to use AI with students at all, or if they should. And then researchers are wondering how to evaluate those outputs and if they can be used. And the question or the answer that I have a lot of times is, well, it depends. It's kind of like the response we give when people ask copyright questions. Well, it depends because context does matter and what they're asking and what their purpose is. We know AI is everywhere at this point. It gets used in a lot of ways. but clarity on how to use it responsibly, I found, is not. So when we think about consequences of AI misuse, here are some things that I use to frame it. So, like, if we avoid discussing AI, it can lead to student confusion and inequity, like who has access versus who doesn't, right? Um, if we replace human support with AI, it might create a short-term fix right now, but it'll yield possibly a really long-term miss. And I'll discuss that a little more later. If we trust AI summaries blindly, we're going to see subtle inaccuracies that are going to abound. And that impacts things like grant funding or approval for research in labs, which I have already witnessed just in the past 6 months. And if we use AI as a primary discovery tool for high quality research, this can lead to flawed literature reviews, as you've already seen in my colleague's presentation, inadequate scientific grounding and backing that also leads to low quality research, which in turn impacts everyone, and sometimes in the form of public policies that are predicated off this type of research. So, what can that responsible, practical AI use look like? And in my experience, and what I have witnessed and what I have done in the past 3 to 4 years, I found that it looks a lot like what libraries already do. We already provide foundational information literacy instruction. We teach patrons how to locate, access, and evaluate information sources and tools. And I see that I can transition those skills pretty easily when I talk about AI resources. So I'm going to bring us to our first case study that I'm going to share with you. And this was an Alzheimer's research activity, and it really focuses on refining and not replacing. So my colleague, Lauren Robinson, in our medical center library here at the University of Kentucky, we were invited to conduct a workshop for an Alzheimer's research team on using AI tools or large language models in the research process. And the team specifically requested guidance on how to use it to locate research and then also how to evaluate those outputs generated by those tools. So there were a few things that had to happen. First, we had to kind of back up and we had to explain that large language models do not have full access to subscription databases. So that means only using those types of tools for discovery of high quality research truly misses the forest for the trees. Like, you're only going to get a small portion of information there. So we had to start with that, like the education piece. We also talked about how it generates problematic text, hallucinates citations, and it cannot reliably replace the structured database searching to meet the needs of this specific research team so that they could pursue those grants, so that they could do the work that they needed to do in their labs. So this is very specific to what they were doing and what this research team needed to accomplish. So instead, what did we do? We used AI to refine researchable questions because we found that that was something they were struggling with, was developing a good researchable question within the context of Alzheimer's research. We demonstrated search hedge development. We compared outputs to mesh vocabulary, and we explained what LLMs can and cannot access. Which leads us to this activity. This is an example activity I used with the research team to help give them practical hands-on experience with LLMs in developing search hedges. And you'll see here on the slide, they have a very specific facet of a much larger research question. And we show them how to verify those AI outputs against mesh because they were primarily using PubMed. So one thing I do want to note is that I didn't require everyone to use an LLM. And several of the people on principal refused to use one for the activity, and that was fine. And that's how I approach all AI instruction. I never make people use the tool. I can demonstrate it for them. I can find a whole host of examples that will demonstrate it for them so they can see it without having to use it themselves. So every group did have people who did and did not elect to use it in this activity. And I wish I could say like I 100% planned that 50-50 divide, but that happened organically. And it was honestly perfect for our discussion. And you know how I said for everything I succeed at, there's something that I fail at too. So in planning for future, this is something you would want to take into consideration, is to make sure that you have enough people in the class that are willing or able to use these types of tools, depending on what your outcome or goal is. And so every team chose a topic. They worked on developing a hedge. They used an LLM within their team of their choosing to create a better search hedge for their facet. All teams recorded their responses in a shared Google slide that you can see here. And what they found is every single team saw that large language models were hallucinating these mesh subject headings. And so why did that matter? We asked them to take that search hedge and try it in PubMed. And what they found is it led to lots of errors in their search, and it reduced the numbers of relevant literature to the type of research that they were doing. And so in that moment, it became very powerful for a team that cut across several different groups. So we're talking about clinicians, we're talking about graduate students, postdocs, a few undergrads. So it was a broad swath of the population that got to see in real time how it impacted their research. And so then we gave them strategies for how to improve that and how to leverage those models. The second case study that I have here is a Tree of Heaven podcast that I did with an undergraduate class. A professor requested library instruction that leaned really heavily into source evaluation. Students were not allowed to use AI to complete their annotated bibliography and presentation. However, their research required them to search the open web for a variety of resources in addition to peer-reviewed literature. So given the scope of the resources that could be used for the assignment, the professor and I discussed and agreed that being able to evaluate AI-generated content would be helpful and essential for students as they were searching on the open web. And so this example is from a lesson plan and how we approach the activity with students. One of the sources students evaluated was a podcast I generated using Notebook LM. I used openly available extension publications, data sets, news, and articles to create the podcast, and the content was accurate. And even when AI was factually correct, students hesitated. There was just something about it. And that hesitation is what made it pedagogically powerful for the discussion. We didn't actually need them to use AI to understand how to evaluate it. So in this case, AI becomes a case study in the theory of knowledge or how we know things. It was a transparency discussion and how information is created and who or what can have authority. And then it was really a moment to articulate the uncertainty they felt within a classroom space that was both open and safe. And I've observed that students desire these clear parameters, guidelines, and practice. And this need for that clearer guidance was reinforced by student comments in some of my fall teaching evaluations in 2025. They requested more instruction on evaluating AI outputs, not using it, but evaluating it. And I think that's important to note that students are asking for this guidance as much as we are seeking it as people who are teaching in classroom spaces. So my next case study has to do with new faculty. Just like you all, many new faculty members come and schedule consultations to ask like, what kind of resources do you have to support instruction or research? And sometimes they ask for recommendation of tools. And during one of these one-on-one sessions, a common concern was the labor-intensive process of creating new slides from existing lecture notes or converting existing and adapting existing slides for different courses. So faculty were asking for AI tools that I would recommend because they were having mixed results with ChatGPT and Copilot. And I do want to clarify and make a note that the University of Kentucky does have a subscription level access to Microsoft Copilot. And so some of them were using that university subscription tool. So what happened in these discussions is we shifted to the topic of like, well, do you really feel comfortable uploading your personal teaching content to a large language model? We discussed that at length, and after confirming that they were comfortable sharing this material in that way, remember, context matters, these discussions matter, we explored tools like Notebook LM and Napkin AI for generating slides and outlines for both in-person and asynchronous delivery. And you'll notice some of my slides in my presentation today, the graphics were generated by Napkin AI. And I included that because that's a reference to the fact that I used it to create that graphic. And that's something that faculty and I also talked about is like when you provide transparency in your teaching and citation, then students can see what that looks like in real time from their faculty as well. So the professor did upload some lecture notes, but what they found is that one of the slides didn't frame the content correctly. But then when they went back to their lecture notes, they were like, you know what? I think the way I framed it is confusing. And so they said, this is actually a good thing because AI caught something that I hadn't noticed before. And so what they did is they were like, I'm going to go back, I'm going to work on this. I'm going to figure out a way to make this clearer before I send this out to students or create additional slides. So in this case, AI is a mirror. It's a revision partner, and it's not just purely the author. And so this was something that helped this new faculty member improve a resource that students were going to be accessing. Now, my next case is something that deals with AI and its use for ADA web accessibility. So I had a colleague outside of the library inquire about using AI tools to help them better understand concepts. And so what they did is they used Microsoft Copilot to create a slideshow to help them better understand this new web accessibility. And they said it did a really good job. It really helped me understand it. I'm thinking maybe I could share this with people in my department. And so we talked about the importance of citing, the use of AI in the creation of the slide deck. But we also talked about how when a policy is so new and hasn't even gone to effect yet, how AI can really lag. And this is especially risky. We discussed this too in legal or compliance contexts. AI supports comprehension sometimes, but humans are the ones who ensure the accuracy and accountability. And anything with legal implications should definitely be reviewed by your administration and legal teams or whoever is appropriate before any kind of distribution. So I'm glad we had that discussion, and it was a moment where we were like, maybe don't send that out. Maybe you should get a little more guidance from your administration and your dean. And so again, this was a faculty member outside of the library, but it was a good teaching moment, and it was good that we had that discussion. Now, my last case study deals with fluency and learning disabilities. And when I encounter researchers and students who are asking how to use AI for drafting research findings or notes to improve coherence, or my response has really evolved over the years. I now consistently ask about the underlying reason, like, why do you think you need AI for this? And importantly, is AI permissible for this specific task or assignment? And I'll say that I didn't always ask that question. And so this is an iterative process, and I'm changing and refining every semester. And so through these consultations, I've learned that the need for AI often stems from difficulties. It could be English language fluency. It could be a diagnosed learning disability like dyslexia. And in these types of cases, patrons confirm they understand their research and what they're talking about, but they just really struggle how to communicate effectively in writing, especially within these tight academic deadlines. And so in these circumstances, I advise the use of real human resources available on our campus and our student support services, such as the Disability Resources Center, We have the Center for English as a Second Language, and we have the Writing Center. And they're going to be better equipped to provide long-term solutions because today this is the assignment in front of you, but you're going to have these types of tasks come up over and over and over. And so while AI might offer that quick fix in this circumstance, it's the human support that is often the most beneficial long term. And that's where the learning is going to yield the greatest outcome. So these consultations I'm finding have frequently served as the first point of contact for students even learning about these essential support services. So never feel like you can't recommend something else because there's a lot of different resources to support students. And that brings me to the end. If we ignore AI, it's going to create chaos. You'll find that students will self-regulate. There's going to be inconsistency, and the vacuum, it sometimes gets filled by just pure guesswork. And so last, one of the things we can think about with effective integration is not should we use it, but how can or should we use it responsibly? And it could also be if at all, depending on the circumstance. So AI should amplify expertise and knowledge, and it should never substitute for it. And I don't think my role is to resist AI, but it's to really help and work with others to teach them how to think about it, how to think about it critically, ethically, and transparently, and to really be introspective about how they use it. Thank you. That brings me to the end.
Great. Thanks so much to Helen and Yulia. We have a little under 10 minutes left for questions, so I'll just encourage everyone to submit your questions. We already have a lot so far. So if you see a question that you'd like to be addressed, definitely use the upvote option. I'll be using that to help select. And I'll also launch a quick poll here that you can fill out as well. Okay, let's get started. So it looks like the most popular question is one that comes up a lot in AI-related webinars about the ethics of using AI when it with its environmental impact. So Karen asks, how can AI use to be ethical when it uses energy and water resources and works by stealing content from people who do not consent to their work being used to train AI? And I guess Helen and Julia, has this come up with talking to students and faculty, and how do you approach this? I think Helen, you talked about how some students, refuse to use AI. So yeah, maybe Helen, I'll start with you on that.
Yeah, sure. I have had, faculty discuss it, students discuss it at length. And if people are like, I don't want to use it, that's fine. I think you have that choice. But in my role, one of the things that I am tasked with doing is helping students understand different resources, information sources, whether they're accurate and how to evaluate them. And AI tools have become information sources, even if it's something that we disagree with them being a good information source or a source of information, that is how they're being utilized based on user behavior. And so when these discussions come up, we discuss it and we talk about it. But then there's also the question of what's the implication of not addressing it at all? Because you don't have to use AI in your class, but most faculty are like, I don't want students to use it, but I want them to understand how to evaluate it. And so in those circumstances, we discuss it, we talk about it. If I have an activity that the professor has asked me to set up, that's a discussion we have is like, do students want to use this? Poll them ahead of time. So there's a lot of user feedback and discussion that goes back and forth in those discussions. But we also talk about the implications of all of the tools that we use in society and through the course of a day and all the materials that we use that pull on environmental resources as well. So we don't isolate AI in and of itself. We also look at like the broader scope of information and the broader scope of tools as well. Like we pull that into the discussion because it's a teachable moment.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Julia, anything to
Helen,
add?
yeah, I just want to compliment. I think it's important for us to bring it up to indicate it as an issue, because first of all, we make students to think about it. Maybe they will come up with a different way, with a new way, as they keep thinking, they're educating, maybe they will create something that more environmentally friendly, right? And we also teach them AI literacy, which makes them more efficient. So, they try to evaluate the cost of each prompt. So as they become more efficient in prompt literacy, that also kind of, justifies, like, I guess, like, I guess it reduces somewhat to whichever extent we can, right? Like, they will be using it anyway, but maybe they will be able to use it more efficiently. And Yes, so I think, as I say, educating them, showing them that that is a concern, so they can make their own choices. They can make choices when they want to use it and when they don't want to use it, right? So I think, we can only do so much, and we can only do it through education. Yeah.
Right. Great. Thank you both. And Yulia, that's a pretty good segue for another popular question. You mentioned prompts. William asks, given the evolution of AI, do you think that prompt engineering is still a skill that students need to learn?
Yeah, that's interesting. I actually was thinking about it today, because it seems like the future is to really going away from prompts. At least, like, I was reading something today, and it made me think about it, that perhaps it will become less relevant. It was very critical for these 3 years that we were teaching them. But I believe you're right. Like, I think we now the technology will use a new approach, that it may not be so critical to use, really, like, to be very proficient in prompt. I still have to read more about it. As I say, like, I'm learning with everyone else. I don't know, Helen, if you read some other updates about it.
I've read some about like the prompt engineering, and I think, to your point, like about your presentation and your slides for your classes, is that this moves really fast. And so like what I was doing in 2023 looks very different from what I did like 3 days ago in a class. And I think that's one of the things that like both of us kind of, had talked about before, is like the need to, you can't just make something and be like, I'm going to stick with this something in perpetuity,
Mhm.
because that's not going to serve you. It's not going to serve students, and it's not going to serve the evolution of what's happening with AI across, I mean, like the Gemini search in a basic Google search didn't exist in that way, in the same way a year ago. So like you have to constantly update. And so I think like, but the work that Yulia did is like what enabled me to work with faculty on a research team to be like, well, let's think about our outputs now, because they know they're putting things in, they're getting something back. But how do they actually look at those outputs? And I think you need both. And you have to start somewhere. And that's where, the industry started, and that's where we started. And we're moving along with it, because it does honestly change. Like I would say every day, but I feel like it's like every 5 minutes, to be quite honest. So,
Great. Thank you both. A couple minutes left. This is popular. This came in for Yulia. From Patricia, what specifically made the students with negative experiences, this was at the end of your presentation, say they would not use AI again in the future? Did you probe this, ask more on that?
Um, um, I Just like generally speaking, like, I don't remember exactly, like, each student, but yeah, like, there were uh, a lot of questions, like reducing creativity, silencing my own voice, my own creativity, and also, so that was a big concern for students. And they would say, some of them, they would say that actually is more time consuming, that I would just go and use search engines and, look for literature or get information some other way that I am familiar with. So those were actually, or they would say like, I really don't want to use that technology. I want to learn more chemistry. Like I want to learn more subject or, disciplinary knowledge. So that were a couple of things I remember from students sharing. Yeah. And it's important for us to recognize all these concerns as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you. It looks like we are at the hour, so I think we'll wrap up here. I'll just say thank you so much to Yulia and Helen and Stacy for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you to our attendees for your questions and comments. We'll make sure to save these questions. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice with links to the recording and today's slides. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from the webinar and hope to see you again soon on another session. Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
so much, everyone. Bye.